Hello, and thank you for joining us for this event as part of Georgetown's virtual reunion weekend. Right now, you're watching our Navigating Race in America panel. A few points before we begin. Please use the Q&A feature in the sidebar to the right of your screen to submit questions to panelists. We will leave time at the end to answer these questions. Full bios for today's speakers are available to view alongside the live stream. Please scroll down below to the video to read them. A recording of this session will be available in the virtual attendee hub later today. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful speakers for today. First, we have Aliyah Graves-Brown, who is a 2017 graduate of the college. She is the Assistant Director of Program Management for the Georgetown Pivot Program, a 10-month business and entrepreneurship program for formerly incarcerated DC residents. Next, we have Morris O'Kelly, who is a 91 graduate of the college, celebrating his 30th reunion this weekend. He is a radio and television commentator specializing in politics and current affairs. Presently, he is heard on weekends as host of the 3-time award-winning The Mo Kelly Show on the #1 news talk station in America, KFI AM 640 in Los Angeles and on iHeartRadio. Next, we have Nigel Scott, who is a 95 graduate of the college, celebrating his 25th reunion. Currently, he is managing attorney of Aegis Law and also serves as the vice chair of the Georgetown University African American Advisory Board. Finally, we have our wonderful moderator, Dean Soyica Diggs Colbert, who is a 2001 graduate of the college and celebrating her 20th reunion. She is currently the interim dean of Georgetown College here at the university. She has written a few books, her most recent being A Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, which was listed by Oprah Magazine as a must-read. Thank you all for being here, and now I will hand it off to our moderator, Dean Colbert.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm so excited about the opportunity to have this conversation. I just wanted to reiterate, that's my husband, class of 2001, Roger Colbert. Please forgive him, audience members. But it's our 20th anniversary, so what can we do? I just wanted to reiterate that if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the Q&A feature. We will be monitoring it throughout the session, and I will be sure to include them as a part of our conversation today. So I wanted to get started with a question for the panel in general. It's been a year since the murder of George Floyd and the global outcry for justice that followed it. In the last year, what has changed in terms of racial justice, and what do we need to do next? I'll start with Mo Kelly.
First, good afternoon, Dean Colbert. Thank you for having me on, and shout out to the class of 91. I would say that not much has actually changed in the past year. We've had protests, we've had calls for changes in legislation, but we've had the arrest and charging and conviction of Derek Chauvin. But big picture, nothing has actually changed. In other words, the conviction of Derek Chauvin didn't necessarily preclude anyone else from suffering that same fate. There's no legislative enforcement protection against that happening again. And it took a confluence of events. We needed a 9-minute video. We needed to have a 9-minute civilian video, not even a body cam video, because that would have been insufficient. We needed to have eyewitness testimony. We needed to have law enforcement officers to come forward and testify against Derek Chauvin to even convict him. That's not going to happen again. That's a perfect storm, if you will, or an imperfect storm. So to answer the question, not much has actually changed. I would look at the conviction of Derek Chauvin, and as we look back on this past year after the murder of George Floyd, that was a moment. I'm not sure that it's developed any momentum, and I clearly don't think that we are in the moment of a movement, big picture.
That's really helpful. And the other point that some commentators have made is that the other confluence being the pandemic, which I know we're going to get back to, but people's availability to participate in protests throughout the world was in part informed by the context of the pandemic. So just thinking about the particular context of Floyd's murder and then the aftermath that followed. Aliyah, in your opinion, what, if anything, has changed, and what do we need to move forward?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, and thank you all for joining us today and for having me. I couldn't agree with Mo more. One point, at least that I've noticed that has changed is, at least in my circles, I have noticed more curiosity, if you will, or more willingness to learn, willingness to engage. And of course, that is very much so as a result of the perfect storm that Morris described. And it is frustrating and enraging in many ways, again, that it took this perfect storm for folks to have a level of engagement or a level of interest, non-people of color, non-Black folks, to have a level of interest that we've been, that we've seen and that I've certainly experienced over the last year. But again, I think, the description of this as a moment is really important. And wanting to keep in mind, that it takes work to move from a moment to a movement, to move towards change, to move towards justice. And as Angela Davis said, freedom's a constant struggle. This is something that will be ongoing. There are many lessons and things that we have learned and will continue to learn and take from our experiences over the last couple of years. But again, it takes work on everyone's part to move this thing from a moment to a movement.
Thank you. And I want to get into how each of you in your own work, how that helps us to think about what we might do to move forward more specifically. But before we get there, big picture, Nigel, has anything changed? What has changed, if anything, and what do we need to do next since the murder of George Floyd?
So I will take a slightly glass full approach, as opposed to perhaps the more realistic approach taken by my friend Mo and by Aliyah. And I would say that one of the positives that I have seen is that there's sort of been a national reckoning around the issue of racial justice and equality. And the way that we see that playing out on the streets, so to speak, or in reality, is that we're seeing perhaps a different approach to the prosecution of law enforcement officers. Maybe not enough, as Mo has stated, to amount to a movement. There certainly is not a movement at this point, but there's incremental change. And I think it's important that we acknowledge those incremental changes, because I think the incremental changes sets the platform for greater change. We could point to improvements in certain jurisdictions and hopefully use that as a model for improvements that we'd like to see in other jurisdictions. So what do I mean by that? Case in point, we had the appointment of Keith Ellison in Minnesota, who oversaw the George Floyd case. That resulted in some change, even though, as Mo has stated, it took sort of like a perfect storm of situations in order for us to achieve that. But we've also seen the appointment of an independent prosecutor in the Ahmaud Arbery case down in Georgia. We've also seen most recently in the case in Louisiana, the victim in that case, I forget his first name, but his last name is Green, where this is a situation where this has been languishing sort of like in limbo for the past 2 years, ever since what I would say is his murder in police custody. And it's only now that we're starting to see some agitation. Footage was released. We had discipline that was handed down to the extent that, a couple officers were fired, whereas for the last 2 years, nothing was really happening. So I would like to think that because of this national reckoning, because of heightened focus on these cases, that we're starting to see law enforcement agencies, we're starting to see DA's offices or prosecutors' offices taking a more nuanced look at these cases. And in some cases, we are seeing some prosecution and at least one significant conviction to date. And of course, there are 3 other cases that are currently pending as a subset or as a spinoff from the George Floyd murder case. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So in terms of what we need to do in terms of achieving change, we definitely need to keep the pressure on. We definitely need to keep the focus on, and we definitely need to ensure that these cases don't fade from the spotlight. Because as we've all seen, it really doesn't take a whole lot of time for the media's attention to move from one case to another, particularly when there are so many cases. It seems to be a series of cases, one right after the other. And before you know it, you blink and you look and it's another name. And we have to ensure that these names don't just sort of like fade into the background just because, some new hot button issue pops up on the media's radar.
I appreciate the focus both on local politics as well as your call for us to keep the pressure on. I often share with my students that although the activities of the civil rights movement, what we call the civil rights movement now, were coordinated, they were made up of local activities of activists responding to the specific needs of their communities at the time. And so, thinking about how we might move from the activities that are happening now to a movement or a more organized collaboration is thinking about both the importance of localized activity, but then of course, as you say, thinking about how it's coordinated into work across the United States and certainly a global movement. So that was helpful from all the panelists, thank you. And so a more specific question, Morris, how does the media industry and the entertainment industry help to perpetuate racial justice in the work that you do? What do you see as the importance of the media industry and the entertainment industry in the fight for racial justice?
Well, there are two parts to that. The first part is understanding what is media, and it's not one thing, it's everything. It's print and online, print in the traditional sense and online in a print sense. There's radio, there's public radio and commercial radio. They don't do the same things. There's broadcast news and there's also cable news, and they're not governed the same way. In fact, cable news is not governed at all by the FCC, where broadcast news is. And I'm saying it, and there's also social media. So it's not one thing, it's everything. And they're all trying to tell this same story, but they have different designs on how that story is told. And some are constrained and some are not restrained at all. And we have to be able to be savvy as consumers of media to ascertain which is a disseminator of information and which is just looking for affirmation. Who are they trying to appeal to? So in the construct of racial justice, if you're tuning into public radio, then you're going to get the who, what, where, when, and why, and how. That's information. But if you tune into Dan Bongino on commercial radio, he is not a news entity. He's just going to give you his feelings about the news. And we as consumers need to be able to differentiate between the two, because Dan Bongino, I'm just using him as an example, his concerns and his goals are very different from public radio or local broadcast news, which is governed by the FCC. And most people don't even know that you may watch CNN, you may watch Fox News or MSNBC, but they're no different in honesty, in totality, than Comedy Central. That's why you can have a Trevor Noah show talking about the news, or Rachel Maddow talking about the news, but neither of them are actually news sources. So to really answer your question, we as consumers have a more of a responsibility in being able to ascertain what quote unquote news source or information source is out there and what they're telling us and why. When we can do that, then we can better focus our efforts in terms of either informing ourselves with news sources, with actual news sources, and putting our message into those media to better move push the movement forward.
That was such a helpful and nuanced answer. Some of the debates that have emerged in response to both the racial injustice and the pandemic have been about how we might understand truth versus fiction and decipher different levels of information. So that lesson you just gave us in different sources is very helpful. I appreciate it. Similarly, Aliyah, to a certain extent, in the outcries that emerged in response to George Floyd's murder, and again, the racial injustice that we witnessed over last summer, there were calls for the abolition of the police. And some might see those calls as in a genealogy of calls for the abolition of the prison industrial complex more broadly. I'm curious, in your work, how do you see justice manifesting itself? And what role do you see universities playing in addressing systematic racism?
Absolutely. I want to quickly address your note about calls for abolition. I think it's so important, and even understanding what the work of abolition is in the context of our team is doing a lot of this work specifically around prison education and the services that we provide in the DC jail. And we were just having this conversation about the ways in which many folks may find the term abolition so jarring, so off-putting in many ways, and not necessarily having a concrete understanding of what calls for abolition actually entail. And so in our work, specifically in prison education, and Bettina Love specifically writes about prison education in this context around demanding what's unimaginable, demanding, the thing that enables for Black and Brown people to experience not necessarily justice, to experience freedom, and all that entails. And so thinking a lot about how our work specifically plays into that, that pursuit of freedom, in the ways in which education plays into that. A lot of our work is meeting folks where they are, right? So we're in the DC jail, offering Georgetown classes to non-traditional students who in many ways have been left behind by traditional modes of education, who in no ways, who are some of the most brilliant folks that we have met, but again, in many ways have been systematically and intentionally left behind by our traditional education system. And so when we think about the role that a university like Georgetown can play in that, I mean, certainly the first step is even having an organization like the Prisons and Justice Initiative, entering local prisons and jails and meeting our folks where they are, and creating pathways for them to pursue education, which in many ways can be a tool for advancement. And so thinking about, Georgetown, and again, universities in particular, there's also this tension between, again, PWIs and institutions like Georgetown doing this work, and also recognizing the importance of HBCUs to be engaged in this work. The prison education industry in many ways replicates a lot of the systems that we see in traditional education systems. These are primarily PWIs, primarily white faculty, entering spaces in which your students are predominantly Black and Brown, low income, first generation college students. And so it's really important for those actors to be mindful of all the systems at play when we enter these spaces. Are the syllabi that we're offering to our incarcerated students, do those reflect diversity? Do they reflect intersectionality? Do they reflect, can students see themselves and their experiences and their struggles and the things that they're learning in the classroom? And our work specifically, even acknowledging our students as students, is a critical piece and something that we're quite mindful of in trying to break down some of these systems of inequity and injustice. And so in terms of addressing systemic racism, at least in our work, again, meeting folks where they are, creating meaningful pathways for folks to reenter society after they have served their time, after they have paid their debt to society, and actually providing meaningful, practical opportunities to come home in a meaningful way is critical to the work that we do.
And just quickly, Aliyah, for our guests who might be class of 2001, the Pivot program didn't exist when I was an undergrad. Could you just tell our viewers what the Pivot program is really quickly?
Absolutely. So what I described is the Prison Scholars Program at the DC jail. We also operate the Pivot program, which is a reentry program. So folks who are coming home, who are looking to reenter society in a meaningful way. PGI has partnered with the business school to offer Pivot. It's a 10-month reentry program focused specifically on business and entrepreneurship. Again, having an understanding of the collateral consequences of incarceration, of felony convictions, and knowing that it's quite difficult. It can be quite difficult for folks with a criminal history to secure employment. Entrepreneurship is a pretty, can be a seamless, not necessarily seamless, but can be a next step that makes sense for a lot of folks. And so we combine entrepreneurial training, liberal arts studies. We've placed our fellows in internships so that they're also experiencing and gaining understanding of a venture from top to bottom. And throughout this 10 months, again, our goal, which has changed over the last couple of years, is to ensure that every fellow who comes through our program is in a stable, full-time employment position post-pivot, right? We understand that not everyone will launch their own venture, but do they have a meaningful understanding of how a venture works? Are they able, because of that understanding, to flourish in a full-time employment role? And again, with the support of the Georgetown system and our network, again, really start to make meaningful changes, meaningful steps towards their goals.
Thank you. Nigel, you already gave us some excellent examples earlier on about the relationship between the law and racial justice, but I wonder if there were any other points that you could direct us towards in thinking about what role the law plays in advancing racial justice.
Sure. And I actually think there's a really good tie-in between the role that the law plays in advancing racial justice, along with steps that we could take ourselves on the local level. And that, of course, plays out in the people that we elect to oversee the law enforcement process or the judicial process in our local communities. And I'm speaking specifically about our prosecutors. Perhaps, I'm betraying my bias here with my focus on prosecutors because I myself am a former prosecutor. And one of the frustrations for me early on in my career was the fact that the office in which I worked, which was the Philadelphia DA's office, the then DA, the philosophical bent was not really focused on issues of equity or racial justice as I see it. Perhaps that's unfair. If that's my bias, I claim it and I own it. Thankfully, that has changed. Speaking specifically around the issue of progressive prosecutors, right? We've heard this term. And for a lot of people, it sounds controversial. It really isn't controversial. We all know that prosecutors exercise a great deal of discretion. And what we've been seeing, particularly since 2016, the 2016 election, and actually, I would go back 2 years earlier to 2014 with Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore with the Freddie Gray case. Even though she perhaps isn't considered one of the progressive prosecutors, I actually think she stood at the vanguard of the wave of progressive prosecutors we saw elected into office since 2014, specifically in 2016, but also continuing now in 2020 and 2021. So who am I speaking of? I speak specifically of Keith Ellison, who I mentioned earlier. He's not a DA, but he's a state attorney general. He was not elected, but he was appointed. I still think it's important that we highlight his influence, particularly as it played out in the George Floyd case, because perhaps with someone with less of an equal justice focus, we may not have achieved the outcome that we saw in the George Floyd case. I'm also speaking specifically about Kim Foxx, people like George Gascon in LA, people like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, who they all came about as that 2016, 2018 wave of local elections after the general elections, which resulted in these changes in office and changes in focus. Just to give an example, Larry Krasner, when he came in, there was a review of close to 200 cases in which there was a police detective that was involved who subsequently it was determined lacked credibility in a lot of those cases. So in one of those cases, the DA's office actually declined to continue the prosecution of that case. And we saw something extreme, relatively extreme happen in Philadelphia, where the judge overseeing the case disagreed with the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in that particular instance and sought to overrule the DA's office, sought to appoint her own special prosecutor, so to speak, to continue the prosecution of this particular individual whom the DA's office had determined there was sufficient doubt about his case or doubts about his case that they did not feel comfortable in moving forward. That case actually made it all the way up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court, in a somewhat milestone or groundbreaking case, ruled that yes, prosecutorial discretion lay with the prosecutor's office, and it was not within the purview of a judge or anyone else to take that away from the district attorney's office. And so thankfully in that particular case, there's a chance that justice will be done and that the DA's office will no longer be pursuing that particular case. But there are others. I was actually mind blown by the situation currently taking place in New Orleans. New Orleans has a new district attorney who could perhaps be considered a progressive prosecutor as well, by the name of Jason Williams. Some of the things that Mr. Williams, who himself is a former defense attorney and former New Orleans council member, is doing is he's declining to prosecute cases where the amount of drugs in controversy falls beneath a certain threshold. So typically in any jurisdiction, you have cases that are earmarked for prosecution where the individual possesses contraband for personal use. And then if the amount crosses a certain threshold, then it becomes a case where the individual is prosecuted with possession for the intent to distribute. So in a lot of these jurisdictions I just mentioned, there has been a renewed focus by the DA's offices where they are no longer prosecuting cases where drugs are being possessed for personal use, where there's a presumption that it's for personal use. So DA Williams in New Orleans is one of these prosecutors whose office has adopted such a policy. Other things that he has done, and it's reflected in other jurisdictions as well, is ending cash bail. The significance of which meaning that if you don't impose cash payment as a condition for release, you make it easier for indigent offenders or suspects or defendants really to have an opportunity to be released back into the community, to remain with their family, to continue working, to continue with their lives until the prosecutor or prosecution has a chance to build a case against them, as opposed to languishing in jail. So that's the importance of reducing or removing cash bail. And this is one of the things that has taken place in New Orleans as well. And he was actually inaugurated into office or sworn into office in January. So it's really just been in the span of 6 months that he started doing this. Another thing that he's been focused on is ending mass incarceration. They're taking reviews of cases where there's problematic situations with police officers who've testified, similar to what has taken place in Philadelphia, and what took place in other jurisdictions as well. And also in terms of the exercise of discretion and how you prosecute, juvenile offenders. Do you prosecute them as adults or do you prosecute them as juveniles? And so that office's focus has been more of keeping the cases in juvenile court rather than moving it to adult court. So what is the upshot of all of this? The upshot is that there's been, like I said, a reckoning earlier where a lot of people are realizing that the way that law enforcement and the way that the judicial system has impacted minority communities has taken such a disproportionate impact or effect on those communities as to sort of negate this idea that there is equal justice for all. We tend to feel that subjectively, but more and more there's objective in this year that this is in fact the case. And perhaps the reason why I'm so focused on New Orleans is because a lot of people may not be familiar with the history of the DA's office in New Orleans. Many of us know Harry Connick Jr. Many of us might not realize that Harry Connick Sr. was for a long time the DA in charge of New Orleans. Now, this is a DA's office which the New York Times editorial about 4 or 5 years ago accused of perpetuating a culture of abuse and indifference to police abuse and prosecutorial misconduct. So the fact that we have moved away from this history, and when I speak of the history, I'm talking about New Orleans, which is of course, part of Louisiana. We're talking about Louisiana, which in 1898 voted in their constitution to utilize non-unanimous juries. We all think that if you go before, a jury and you're accused of a criminal offense, the jury has to vote unanimously. All 12 jurors have to vote one way or the other. Well, that's true. And the US Supreme Court in 1972 did in fact rule that non-unanimous juries violated the Sixth Amendment. However, 2 states, Oregon and Louisiana, found a way around that by exploiting loopholes that allowed them to continue to try offenders or defendants and convict them with non-unanimous or split juries. New Orleans, to its credit, or I should say Louisiana to its credit, 3 years ago in 2018, did do away with split verdicts. So you still have that 120-year period of this non-unanimous verdicts. But even though it did away with the implementation or the use of non-unanimous verdicts, there still remained the issue of what about the people who'd already been convicted by non-unanimous verdicts. And so the US Supreme Court last year finally ruled, it closed the loophole, so to speak, by ruling that these cases retroactively had to be overturned and perhaps tried anew. So circling, the conversation and bringing it back for full circle, I should say, this is one of the things that DA Williams is doing in New Orleans. They've taken a proactive approach to reviewing these cases, and in instances where organizations such as the Innocence Project are looking or seeking to overturn these cases where people were convicted by non-unanimous verdicts, they're not objecting. They have a right to object and perhaps have a hearing before a judge. They've taken the position where they're not going to object in those cases, making it easier for people incarcerated under such a system to see, true justice play out perhaps for the first time in their lives. So in terms of what we can do, we can continue to elect or support the election of progressive prosecutors, so to speak, so that we can see justice playing out, not in some sort of like a grand scheme, but actually playing out with real world consequences in our local communities.
Thank you. That was helpful in drawing attention to the systemic aspects and some of the recourse to them. I have a follow-up question for the panel about some of the structural issues that have been raised over the last year. But before I get to it, I just want to remind our audience to please drop any questions you have in the Q&A portal, and I will be sure to ask them of our panelists as well. Maybe I can begin with Mo and then just go around our Hollywood squares. In addition to the uprising last summer, of course, we've all been living through the global pandemic caused by the COVID-19, and that's part of the reason why we're virtual today and not out on Healy Lawn or out, in Harari Hall. And of course, the pandemic not only exposed the ways in which we're interconnected, but also the disparities in our healthcare system and otherwise with regards to race and class. Could you talk some about what lessons you've learned? And again, any takeaways that you would like to share in terms of how we could move forward in responding to the pre-existing conditions, as Nigel was outlining, the pre-existing conditions of systemic racism and class disparities in our country?
I think the pandemic highlighted not only the real disparities in between how we had to deal with COVID-19 in terms of our comorbidities, in terms of our susceptibility, but also from a media standpoint, it showed the livid indifference in a racial sense, how America did not care about those healthcare disparities. And because in a media sense, it was politicized, or it was allowed to be politicized, you could see the underpinnings of racism in this way. As long as Black and brown people were dying disproportionately, it was considered a hoax. It was considered as something that was less than important for this nation to adequately address. And I think that's where the media comes in terms of what I do and what other people who are responsible when they have their platforms is to tell and to give an accurate picture of not only the actual disparities, but in the disparate treatment of those who we deem worthy of sympathy or care, or somehow that our deaths, going back to literally Black Lives Mattering, that our deaths did not matter as much as other people's deaths. And as long as we were dying, then it was okay. And I think that highlights the racial disparities, not only in how we were dealing with COVID-19, but how America was dealing with us, dealing with COVID-19.
Yeah, that's very helpful. It made me think about, as you were talking, and then just thinking about having New Orleans on our mind, the representation of Black people dying after Hurricane Katrina. And when I talk to my students, I sometimes think about how that was a tipping point in terms of how we understood Black disposability that led into some of the responses to deaths, very public deaths of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and others that then emerged with the Black Lives Matter responding to those deaths. So it's interesting to think about how some of these local contexts feed into media responses and help to advance racial justice and or draw attention to the lack thereof, as you described. Aliyah, same question. What lessons have you learned from the pandemic in terms of how we might understand the pre-existing condition of American racism?
Absolutely, and I'd like to address this specifically in the context, obviously, of my work and our students at the jail and the returning citizens that we get to work with in Pivot. And so in addition to all of the comorbidities and experiences of folks on the outside, our students for the last year have been locked into their cells for 23 hours a day. All social visits and for a while, legal visits were not taking place. Folks were cut off essentially from the outside world almost completely. And so, already having an understanding about the ways in which secure facilities intentionally and just, separate folks from their loved ones, piling on a pandemic, exacerbated in many ways things that we already know need to be corrected within our prison system. Again, similarly, thinking through access to healthcare, which is already a stressed system behind on the outside. Again, even more so behind bars. Figuring out how to get access to COVID tests, right? That simply was not taking place behind bars. Social distancing, access to clean water and soap. Again, challenges that we were all experiencing that were even more intense behind bars. Access to hand sanitizer, again, not even allowed in most facilities because of the alcohol content. And so when you think through how to keep folks safe, again, knowing that many of the folks who are currently incarcerated are Black and brown folks, and then again, layering on this experience of incarceration and in many ways worsening the situation. And so in terms of what I've learned and taken from all of that, again, it's just a reminder of how urgent and how important, again, the work of abolition is. That's something that I believe in, a radical reimagination of what our criminal legal system looks like, abolition of our prison industrial complex and all the many things that fuel that complex, because again, our brothers and sisters behind bars had, again, even with all of the day-to-day complications of an experience of incarceration, piling on a pandemic, simply exposed, and in many ways, like I said, highlights the urgency of our work and a reminder of the importance of caring for folks who are often forgotten.
Thank you. We have some questions piling up in the chat, but before we get there, I want to give Nigel a chance to respond if you would like to this question around, lessons from COVID and again, what it taught us or what you might have learned or knew about racial justice and racism in America.
So it's hard for me to find something new to say, given that Mo and Aliyah have already stolen my thunder, so to speak. But what I would say is that perhaps, maybe not so much what I learned, but I think America learned a great deal about healthcare disparities, the way African-American, Black and brown communities are targeted for or treated for healthcare issues or the healthcare that's available to them relative to the quote unquote mainstream population. But also, I think one of the things that has come to light over the course of the past 18 months is that there's a high degree of skepticism in Black and brown communities towards the healthcare system and the delivery of healthcare in our communities. We all, of course, most of us would be familiar with cases such as, the cases involving Tuskegee or Henrietta Lacks, or some of these historic cases, which for some of us, we're only familiar with them through our, textbooks or through our own research. I think cases like that have received greater spotlight, increased spotlight since COVID, because it's sort of underlying that this has not been something that's new that's suddenly popping up, but certainly the skepticism has almost been generational, right? We hear these stories that have been passed down in our communities about why we shouldn't trust the healthcare system or, public health experts, so to speak. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but it's a problem that we created, we being the United States of America, created ourselves. Prior to this, I don't believe there was sufficient outreach to Black and brown communities to achieve buy-in on public health initiatives. We've seen it playing out in other communities. There's a great deal of vaccine skepticism outside of the Black and brown communities. In New York City, you're seeing it played out most specifically in Hasidim communities. And so it's not just something that's restricted to Black and brown communities, but because of the disproportionate impact that we see in our communities, it's magnified, so to speak. I also wanted to piggyback a little on what Aliyah was saying Aliyah did a good job in pointing out the problems experienced by incarcerated individuals in terms of access not only to healthcare, but also to their own attorneys. In a lot of cases, face-to-face meetings with attorneys and their clients, had been impacted as well. But perhaps what has not been highlighted has been the outsized impact of COVID on incarcerated populations. And of course, as we know, there's been a disproportionate representation of Black and brown bodies within the quote unquote prison industrial complex. As sort of like a natural consequence, the infection rates in prison, because of the restrictive movements, because of the inability for people to socially distance, there's been a spike of COVID infection rates in prisons, not just on the federal level, but also on the state level and on the local levels in jails as well. And that, of course, has played out in a disproportionate impact on our communities as well, seeing that we tend to be overrepresented in those among that population.
Thank you. I have a question that's circling back to something that Morris said earlier. And the question is, in your opinion, how has social media impacted today's movement compared to earlier movements for racial justice?
I would put it this way. I look at what Dr. King did without a radio show, without a TV show, without an Instagram account, without a Twitter account, and he was able to mobilize. But that took place over the period of months and almost years. Going back to George Floyd, which was the jumping off point for this conversation, social media made all that come together in literally hours across many cities. And let's not forget, it was not just George Floyd's death, it was also Breonna Taylor's death within that same media space, that same social media space that people were talking about and thinking about and allowed the world to see. We talk about the confluence of this perfect storm. I call it imperfect storm because a lot of things had to go wrong for something good to happen. But we talk about how all these things had to happen at the same time. A lot of that had to do with social media being able to show people in real time the lack of care and concern for the humanity of George Floyd, and that resonated around the world. And that was distinctly and directly connected to social media's influence and impact to be able to inform just about everyone in the world. And so you had a mobilization of people from coast to coast and arguably around the world within a space of hours, as opposed to weeks and months, which we saw in the modern day civil rights movement. And I think that's how social media has had a disproportionate yet positive impact in many ways on how we mobilize people in today's world as opposed to previous years.
I appreciate you bringing up the name of Breonna Taylor, because another question about media was asking why is there not as much coverage or discussion when a victim of, I'm assuming, racialized violence is female? What do the panelists think? And so that question wasn't just for you, Morris, it's for the whole panel, but I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say. I was grateful for you bringing up Breonna Taylor.
No, just very quickly. Video has a large part to do with it. You couldn't turn away from a 9-minute video. Yes, there is less influence, I should say, less concern or care for female victims. That can't be denied. But if we're going to juxtapose Breonna Taylor specifically with George Floyd, the video is what made the difference for a lot of people. When you see a man die in front of you, even though it was less violent than how Breonna Taylor died and was murdered, it's more abstract. Where George Floyd, we heard his voice, we saw his physical pain, we saw his agony, and we saw him expire right in front of us.
Thank you. Aliyah, Nigel, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
I would just add in terms of the why, which is, not the rosy answer, but I think in many ways there's truth to it, is that unfortunately, Black women, in many ways, we are the least valued members of society. When thinking through the intersectionality of gender and race, in many ways, we find ourselves at the bottom. And so that's the simple why, again, not the rosy why, but there's so much truth to that. And we see that play over, and we've seen that continue to play itself out. When it comes to female victims, there are many, in many instances, folks can, almost never name a Black female victims of racialized violence, but we can rattle off those of our male counterparts. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the ways in which those stories are highlighted continues to point out how important it is to have conversations about the impact of all of our different identities and how they come to play in the ways in which we're received by society, and the ways in which society cares for us and places values on our value on our lives.
Thank you. Nigel, this question isn't directed to you, but I think you might have a good answer for us. The question is, with the deluge of state laws that seek to curtail voting rights and our voting access, how can we regular citizens maximize the chances of progressive candidates winning? You're still on mute.
Sorry about that. So I think, first of all, I think one of the things that we need to try to figure out is how can we arrest this movement or this response to progressive cases or progression in terms of achieving social justice, achieving equal rights within such a short space of time since the Derek Chauvin trial and the January 6th insurrection leading up to the present time. What can we do to confront or to counter this backlash? And what I see as potential solutions would be to continue to keep the pressure on our state and federal representatives, right? It's very difficult for each of us in our own isolated little bubble to do a whole lot. But particularly in cases in states such as Georgia, particularly in places such as Texas, and maybe Florida to a lesser extent, where we're seeing the passage of these legislations, we need to ensure that we put pressure on those state legislatures to the extent that we, you know, and when I say we, I speak as a Democrat. I have to disclose my, you know, my political leanings. Perhaps in those states where we're in the minority, where it's difficult for us to specifically counter what happened in those legislatures, the solution would be to put pressure on the federal level, because Congress has the opportunity and has the ability to overwrite perhaps everything that's being done on a state level, because as it stands, voting rights is a federal issue and subject to federal law. And, you know, the preemption clause of the US Constitution states that when a state law is in conflict with a federal law, the federal law takes precedence. And so it's important that we continue to push for changes, positive changes in those federal laws. Several years ago, we perhaps suffered the biggest setback since 1964, when Congress allowed, you know, the Voting Rights Act to pass, not to pass, but to expire, certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act to expire. And then the Supreme Court followed up on that by ruling that the provisions that were in controversy were no longer necessary, that states somehow magically over the course of the last 50 to 60 years, you know, had this turnabout in conscience where it was no longer the case where voting rights were being suppressed. Of course, we see the bald-faced lie being played out in front of us today. That is not the case. So there's an opportunity, and the Supreme Court, just to finish the thought, punted the issue back to Congress and said, look, if you want to change this, it is 100% within your purview and within your ability to change this. There is some agitation currently to tighten up voting rights in Congress, but of course it's running into interference by, you know, the Republicans in Congress, you know, who are threatening to use the filibuster. And I hate to make this political, and it's really not my intention, but I believe what I'm saying here is not so much political advocacy as much as it's a recitation of facts. And the facts is, you know, the fact is there's great, you know, hesitancy on the part of the Republican Party to make any sort of change in the current laws as they exist. There's some hesitancy on the part of the Biden administration to just, you know, sort of like run roughshod over any opposition that the Republicans might have by doing away with the filibuster. I think that it's something that we as individuals need to seize the initiative and contact our congressional representatives, both in the House and the Senate, and let them know that these are situations, that these are items that are important to all of us. And it's important that we push for cementing or shoring up of voting rights across the United States and on the federal level, so that we don't have to focus on putting out fires in 50 or 60 different jurisdictions, as the case might be, in the states and in the associated US territories.
I appreciate that. I'm certain that all of us can get behind, in a democracy, wanting to have robust access to voting, and wanting to be able to have full participation of our citizens, in advocating to our elected officials. And so both of those things that you highlighted, I think, are important. Another question in the chat, the question is, thank you so much for your time. After George Floyd was murdered, my white friends began to reflect on their privilege and made an effort to learn more about anti-racism. Much of that has gone silent lately. How can we keep this at the forefront? And I think this, is just echoing, how do we keep the movement going, or keep the momentum going from last summer? So, Mo, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or any of the other panelists.
I'm a little more cynical than most people, so this is going to be a cynical answer. I don't believe that this country is serious about understanding race or appreciating the history of Black and brown people in this country. I don't want this to devolve into critical race theory, but I'm saying that is a component of the conversation. And to the question of how do we stay engaged? Well, as far as Black folks are concerned, we just keep on living, because there's going to be another George Floyd before the year is out. And unfortunate, but I believe that to be true. It'll be a different name. The circumstances will be slightly different. So it's not necessarily a function of how do we keep the conversation going. That will take care of itself. But how do we stay engaged, to Nigel's point, as far as not only politically, but legislatively? Because it's nice to tweet, it's nice to have a hashtag, but it's even better if you have a piece of legislation that someone can sign, not only on the federal level, but the state level. And when we talk about George Floyd, I want people to remember, policing for the most part is a local issue, not a federal issue. You could talk about federal laws, but it's not going to impact the police department in your town, in your city. And we have to be engaged on a local level to make sure that we are passing laws. Like, for example, in California, not all police departments have body cams. LAPD does, LA County Sheriff's Department does not. That's something that we need to handle locally. And Nigel had mentioned George Gascon, who's our LA County District Attorney. He's under fire right now for all these changes that he's trying to make as being a progressive prosecutor, small p, and they're trying to recall him. So that means we have to stay engaged if we want to keep someone like George Gascon in office, and who will be more responsive to our interests. So it's not just the conversation, it's also the content of our actions, in the sense of, are we putting forward legislation which is actually going to have a determinative effect on our lives on a day-to-day basis. I appreciate the conversation. It's what I do every single day, but I'm more insistent that we need to have a legislative component to it.
Thank you. Aliyah, Nigel, I don't know if you want to respond to that question.
It would essentially be a repetition of what Mo just said and what I said earlier. Absolutely, we can continue talking about it until we're blue in the face, but it's sort of like, gun violence, right? We're not going to see or gun control. We're not going to see anything happen until we, see boots on the ground doing something about it, in Congress. I absolutely echo what Mo has said.
Thank you. And to the point of action that we can take, we have a question, this may be our last question, which is, what are the non-negotiable actions you would advise people in our community to do in an effort to keep the pressure on? So after they leave this panel in 6 minutes and we go back to our, local jurisdictions, what are some action steps that we can take to keep the pressure on, specifically, whether that's in our everyday work life or in our communities? Mo, do you have any responses to that?
Just for me, I always advocate for body cams. I want law enforcement to be forced to wear body cams. I want them to be held accountable. If there is any type of interaction with the public and the body cam is not on, we need to, if we had another 4 hours, we talk about qualified immunity and having these officers be accountable for their actions in a way other than just the city paying out money. It's one thing when the city of Minneapolis gives out $27 million to the Floyd family, but it doesn't impact either the police department or the policing of that community. We need to change how it impacts these law enforcement officers and how that will change policing going forward. So I'm insistent always about body cams and consequences for the non-use of them.
Thank you. Aliyah, what action can we take to keep the pressure on in our local communities?
Absolutely, yeah. Sticking with the thread of local politics. Similarly, in mass incarceration takes place on the local and state level. That's where the vast majority of folks are incarcerated. And so thinking through, you know, do you live in a jurisdiction where there is an elected DA? What are that person's policies? What is that office working towards? Does your jurisdiction provide supports, meaningful supports and programming for folks while they are incarcerated, when they come home? What is your jurisdiction's current stance on, there's, you know, a large movement around banning the box when folks are aiming to secure employment when they come home. The first step is learning what those things look like where you live. And secondly, again, voting, figuring out the folks who are in power, what their stance is. And if you're interested in changing that, then mobilize to do so. There are several examples across our country, like Nigel pointed out earlier, progressive prosecutors in various offices, even locally in DC. I think in many ways for reentry support, DC leads the country in many ways in terms of the supports that are provided for formerly incarcerated folks, right? So there are models out there, and I think the first step is learning, you know, what's available in your area, and are your elected officials are they putting forth and supporting legislation that supports the things that are important to you and your community?
Thank you. And Nigel, same question. What are some active steps that we can take in our local community to keep the pressure on?
Generally speaking, just become more involved. And when I say become more involved, I don't just mean on Facebook. I don't just mean on Twitter. Mo and I argue back and forth all the time on Facebook, but it hasn't changed. You know, it doesn't really amount to a hill of beans because we don't take that outside, generally speaking. He does and I do in our respective communities, but most of us don't. So you have to become involved. And what do I mean by becoming involved? Like Aliyah said, become involved, and like Mo has stated as well, on the state and local level, in terms of your advocacy for change in your local municipal councils, in your state legislatures, but also on the federal level. Because at the end of the day, as Mo has stated, policing is largely a state function. It states in the Constitution, right? So the federal government is very limited in how it can influence policing on the state level. And one of the ways that the federal government does that is by the power of the checkbook, right? The power of the pocketbook, as they say, so to speak. What do I mean by that? So as we might recall from the Ferguson incident, when we looked out on the street, we saw a lot of like heavy armored equipment like rolling down through Ferguson. A lot of these equipment was donated by the federal government. Before President Obama left office, he started to oversee a change in the policy where the federal government was sort of like just donating, you know, these surplus military equipment to police departments. One of the ways that the federal government utilizes its power, so to speak, to influence policing is to offer positive reinforcement for changes. So if the police departments want to receive federal donation of equipment or federal funding, they have to hit certain milestones. Well, in order for you to have those policies in place, those policies must be coming out from the federal level. So certainly you want to put pressure on your federal elected officials. You want to try to elect people that reflect your values. But all of that aside, I think a great way for all of us to become involved, even, you know, safely ensconced behind our computer screens, is for us to engage in what I like to call, you know, checkbook activism. You know, give to causes. You know, using New Orleans specifically again as an example. Under Harry Connick Sr., there were 36 cases that were brought by the Innocence Project, where they accused his office of prosecutorial misconduct. In more than 50% of those cases, in 19 of those 36 cases, the cases were actually overturned because an appellate court reviewed that case and found that there was, in fact, prosecutorial misconduct. So I would like for people to give to causes such as the Innocence Project, to organizations such as the Equal Justice Initiative, right? To organizations such as the ACLU, and to other, perhaps moving away from the equal justice aspect and just politically speaking, give to candidates whose values reflect the sort of change that you would like to see play out, not just in your local community, but across the US as well. So engage in a little bit of checkbook activism is what I would say.
Thank you so much. From the theoretical to the practical. I want to thank the panelists for your insights. I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of our union weekend. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.